The first chapter of Glenn Parsons' The Philosophy of Design is dedicated to the definition of the word design. Parsons goes through many iterations, finally arriving at design is the intentional solution of a problem by the creation of plans for on the sort of thing. I liked this definition at first, but began to grow wary when I thought about how game design fits within it. Most of it fits my intuition quite well. The primary verb of game design is certainly planning. Most of us strive to make as new a sort of thing as we can, given the constraints of hardware, budget, schedule, physics, and imagination. But while we certainly solve many problems as game designers, it's difficult to think about a game as embodying the solution of a problem. What kind of problem do games solve? As an educational game designer, I am trying to solve pedagogical problems, and many other serious games attempt to solve, or at least alleviate, problems in the world. There are citizen science games which tackle concrete research problems. Fundamentally, though, what problem does a game solve? Too much free time. Not enough software to sell proprietary hardware. There is an argument to be made that games solve the problem of fulfilling psychological needs in their players, or their creators. By this logic, you would have to art and design together, as the arts are usually associated with primarily being of use, inasmuch as they are able to alter their audience's state of mind. You might be willing to stop there and say that game design is a misnomer, and game designers should instead be called interactive artists or some sort. I certainly have some sympathy with this view. I find game design to be very creative in character, but not all creativity is art. There is something about the practice of game design, especially when done in collaboration with a team, which seems more like the design of a chair than like painting on canvas. The constraints are more palpable, the purpose more distinct. Perhaps the definition is still insufficient. Note, the resolution of this conflict, I believe, comes with the realization that coming up with the initial idea for a game is indeed not a process of design, but rather an artistic one. Everything that comes after that is the design part. We are solving the problem of how should we make this. The idea may be a theme, a story, a genre, a feeling, a mechanic, or any combination thereof. But we will always need design to support and realize that idea. Think about it by analogy to the design brief that industrial or graphic designers are given. We need a logo which embodies the dependability of our company and which can be used in a monochrome letterhead. This is not a logo, but is part of the idea for one. In game design, the distinction can get quite muddied, as we are usually not presented with game ideas by a client, but rather by some part of our own team, or our own mind, and therefore the process of settling on an idea and the beginning of the design process blend into one another temporarily. Skeptics of this notion might argue that this kind of artistic invention happens all throughout the process of game design: stories, visuals, music. So why should the initial idea be privileged in this way? I would respond by saying that additional artistic invention act primarily as support for the initial idea, rather than artistic objects in their own right, in the way that additional constructions may be necessary if a geometric proof or floral carvings might give the chair a more old-fashioned character. Taking this to its conclusion, one might say that Michelangelo's painting of the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel may be, in fact, an act of design, insofar as the guiding vision behind the project was not an affecting image which depicts God's relationship to man, but an not inspiring chapel, and the painting exists in service of that. I find this realization very freeing, because Though I enjoy the ideation process and of course I have more game ideas that I could execute in 10 lifetimes, it takes the pressure off the designer to create game ideas that fit their team. Those ideas can and should come from anywhere. It also confirms all of our suspicions about those so-called idea men. We tend to meet at parties and in shared lift rides. They may in fact have good ideas, but they cannot be called game designers because they have not yet engaged in the process of design at all. So, we find ourselves out of the rain and back under the umbrella of design. After all, alongside our brethren in architecture, graphic design, industrial design, etc. Now, perhaps, with greater appreciation for the role of the designer in games and a closer understanding of what most consider the beginning of the game design process, which is not, in fact, game design. Bobby Lockhart is a game designer at Important Little Games and Code Combat. You can follow him on Twitter at BobbyLocks. Note, it's no mistake that this period is outside the quotation marks. The author is using logical punctuation. Each of Sega's Yakuza games contains multitudes. For example, Yakuza 0, the series prequel released outside of Japan early last year, sets itself up as a playable crime serial set in 80s Japan. But it can also be a cabaret management game, a blind date sim, a 3D beat 'em up, an emulator of old Sega arcade classics, a rhythm game, a light-hearted RPG about solving strangers' problems, a real estate management game, and a surprisingly good place to learn the basics of tabletop games, like shogi and mahjong. From a developer's perspective, the scope of such a project seems daunting. From a player's perspective, it can be overwhelming. My partner and I recently completed Yakuza 0, and saw that our 87 hours of combined play merited a completion score of roughly 33%. The hook that holds together all these disparate game design elements that put us on the scores of Western players like us through the game is the writing. For all its focus on cold-hearted criminals and petty evil, Yakuza 0 is a remarkably funny game. It affords players the freedom to quickly jump from incredibly serious macabre scenes, a criminalist tortured in a warehouse, to teach a shy punk band to act like rude dudes in public. That writing is translated and localized for the West by Atlas, alongside longtime series translator Inbound, starting with Yakuza 0 and continuing on through Yakuza Kiwami, the remake of the original 2005 game, and Yakuza 6. The localization of all three games has been overseen by Atlas, Scott Strickhardt, who recently sat down to chat about the ins and outs of adapting these games, humor and gravity for Western players. It was an interesting conversation that went beyond the localization process. Atlas uses a translator-editor tag-team approach, rather than relying on translators alone, to touch on how, exactly, you translate humor, and how players in different regions can view a game, or its characters, completely differently. What follows is a version of that conversation we have edited for clarity. Strickhardt, the humor of a Yakuza game, is a fine line to walk. It's very clear when the developers want to be funny. It's very clear to us when the writing that exists in the game is supposed to be like, haha, here's a joke. So we just want to make sure that if they intended for it to be funny, it also has to be funny to our audience. Whether or not that means changing the dialogue a little bit, changing the style in which it's delivered, making dialogue options a little bit more punchy, that kind of thing. One of the perfect examples is, in Yakuza 0, Majima encounters this Did you play the sub-story where he goes to infiltrate a cult? In that sub-story, one of the options he has is to crack a pen, in order to get this girl to snap out of her cult tendencies. So in Japanese, that pun is futon or futon dog, which means a futon is a futon, or a futon flies. It's a pun on words. It's basically a why did the chicken cross the road kind of joke. If we literally translated that, it would not work. If we put in, why did the chicken cross the road, it's not much of a pun. It does not feel in line with Majima's character. So that's where we had to come up with this pun that we ultimately went with, which was, how do you avoid dangerous cults? Practice safe sex. Well, it was not just me. We have a team of translators and editors who approach these games